Hi, everybody. Thanks for being with us. Does anybody remember that joke by Stephen Wright? It's a small world, but I wouldn't want to paint it. Well, it's a small world, but I wouldn't want to build it. And that's why we're here talking about infrastructure, investing in infrastructure particularly. Now, this is not the kind of investing you see a lot in the headlines in the Wall Street Journal. Infrastructure investing, the focus is often a quarter century rather than a quarter of a calendar year. The goal is often, as I understand it, boring, predictable returns, not the kind of sizzle you might get from hedge funds or private equity deals. And some people even call it private equity on Valium, which I think one or two of our panelists might take issue with. But there are a lot of opportunities in infrastructure investing right now, largely because governments everywhere are running short of money to do these projects, and they need help from the private sector. So we're going to talk about how to find some of those deals, how to navigate those deals, and how to help build roads, bridges, tunnels, ports, and all the other things that cities and states need. So I'll introduce our all-star cast. Andrew Clarout, down on the end, is with the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan. He's one of those bemused Canadians looking at our presidential race, wondering what is wrong with America. Kathy Hahn is next to me. She's with the North Carolina State Treasurer's Office. Sadir Hari, and I apologize if I mispronounce your last name. I gave it a good go, with IFC Asset Management Company. Next to her, Scott Mackin, managing partner with Denham Capital, and at the end, Greg Smith with Instar AGF Management. So, Andrew, I'll start with you. Give us a little more detailed introduction to infrastructure investing than I'm able to do.
Okay, sure. I mean, infrastructure investing is buying into assets like private equity. We do it all through private assets with the use of leverage and with the view to make the asset more valuable through active asset management. But buying in assets that provide essential services to local communities primarily. And because of the essential service nature to them, they end up being quite differentiated in their behavior from a traditional equity. So you've got something which demonstrates good downside protection, not super heavily tied to GDP as an example. Something that in good economies, bad economies, you can get confidence around their ability to perform. We group it into a broader category of real assets, along with real return bonds, real estate, and to some extent, natural resources. And we do that because it generally pays a current coupon. It generally provides inflation protection, and it provides diversification benefits as well. So it actually performs a very important component to our plan. You know, we have contribution rates that are $2.5 billion less than our benefits that we pay out every year. And so this fits very nicely into our plan, where it provides current income to help satisfy those pensions. It provides inflation protection, which helps make sure that we satisfy that pension promise, which includes inflation protection to our members. And it provides diversification, which means that if we have an economic downturn where equities could suffer, as an example, this should be some of the ballast in our portfolio that helps mitigate some of those more acute GDP-tied risks.
Yep. Greg, can you talk about how to find deals? I mean, they're everywhere. How do you find ones that work for your whatever your investing needs are?
Oh, sure. I mean, now just carrying on, somebody asked me, what do you invest in? I used to say we invest in things from extremely boring to barely interesting. I mean, that's our space. I like the private equity Valium kind of comment.
That broad.
That broad. We have a very broad investment mandate.
Well, that's a good investment. It means nothing's going wrong, right?
Exactly. You know, if we take partly a step back, I mean, we see a lot of the data. I mean, I used to do presentations and talk about a McKinsey study that talked about the infrastructure deficit just to keep up with the disrepair of our infrastructure, and they said $50 trillion is required between now and 2030. The new McKinsey study came out, and now it's $90 trillion between now and 2030, and nobody skipped a heartbeat. I mean, it's just the state of disrepair of infrastructure. And what's needed as we look at urbanization and different trends is just absolutely massive. Now, on the other side of that, what we've also seen is sort of the increase in allocations. So in 2011, the average institutional investor had 3.5% allocation to infrastructure. In 2015, it's now 4.3%. So at the same time as we see this massive deficit and need around infrastructure, we see this increasing inflow around infrastructure. what we're sort of seeing today is we're focused on the mid-market. So when you ask me, what are we seeing in deal flow today? There's some great panels that were going on. It's nice sort of coming in last to the panel because you can listen to what everybody else is saying. But the urbanization trends, what's happening around demographics, technology, environmental, climate change, around demographic change is actually just a huge driver of new types of infrastructure investment and investment opportunities in the way we actually live, work, and conduct business today.
What does mid-market mean?
Mid-market is really infrastructure investments that are less than $1 billion in enterprise value in total. So if you looked at the amount of infrastructure investment that's required in North America, 70% of infrastructure investments are actually less than $1 billion. So it's really looking at the municipalities, universities, schools, and hospitals, the MUSH sector, and what their needs and their drivers are.
Sadi, you focus on Asia. Can you tell us who are the matchmakers? Who figures out what projects need funding and where the funding should come from?
So there isn't any one set of matchmakers. It could be people like the IFC, where I work, which is an organization owned by 186 different governments to bring together private capital with public projects. It could be your M&A banker. It could be the governments. There's a whole host of people. And I guess one of the interesting things about Asia and emerging markets in general is that there's a huge number of projects that need financing. There's a huge amount of dry powder in the form of infrastructure funds or pension plans or insurance companies. And yet there is a big gap in terms of investors cannot find bankable projects and projects cannot find investors. So that's kind of the conundrum that creates.
So what's the problem?
I guess the problem is twofold. So on the side of the investors, what they're looking for in emerging market infrastructure generally, and Asia specifically, they want two things. They want strong bankable contracts, which have a number of obligations from the government. And then they want high returns. High in infrastructure terms is 15 to 18% in US dollars. That's an acceptable return in emerging markets. The government wants exactly the opposite. They want to give as few concessions as possible, and they want low affordable tariffs. And the irony is, even when they can sometimes come to an agreement in terms of having a tariff and a set of documents that works for both parties, investors are still very concerned that governments may or may not honor their payment obligations and their performance obligations, because these contracts are typically 25, 30 years long, and governments change every 5 years. So that's kind of the source of the gap.
And does that leave projects that just basically go unfunded and never completed or never even started?
Yes, there are many, many projects in the Philippines. For example, they're putting, I think, 50 projects out for bidding in terms of public-private partnerships. Only 5 of them have made any headway. In Pakistan, we've been trying for years and years and years to get another 5,000 megawatts funded, but we can't attract foreign investors. So yes, there are many projects that are still looking for investors.
So you're one of those, Kathy, you're one of those foreign investors. The Philippines would probably love to have you come in and put some money into one or two of their projects. You've had some trouble finding good projects to invest in, though, right?
Right. Well, I guess I would start out. I work for a state pension, North Carolina. And if infrastructure investing is really boring and predictable, as we say, I would love it. We would have a ton of it, but we actually don't. We only have about 1% of our plan's money, which is probably less than $1 billion in infrastructure investment at this time. And the main reason being that there's different types of risk that come in when you go to emerging countries like Pakistan and so on. And we also invest mostly through managers, and it's really hard to find managers with track record in emerging countries, period. So it's a lot more difficult to find 8 to 12% type of lower risk, stable return, cash flowing, inflation sensitive type of infrastructure investment from where I sit, and I think where a lot of public plans sit, where there's a lot of money, where we do want to invest in cash flowing, lower risk infrastructure investment that really fits our liability. So
what happens to that money? What happens to that fund? It just goes uninvested?
Oh, you mean our pension money?
Yeah.
So
The portion that's set aside for the infrastructure fund.
Oh no, we wouldn't set it aside. It would go into other strategies.
But it's there, and it is just not invested into the thing it could be allocated toward?
If we are able to find lower risk, stable cash flowing infrastructure investments with the longevity that fits our liability and the risk return works, I think our allocation to infrastructure would go up.
Scott, you work with some projects in Africa and other places. How do you deal with these types of risks?
Well, maybe I should position ourselves among this group first. The way we underwrite these transactions is probably more the highest end infrastructure returns, kind of getting into private equity returns. But because we're backing management teams on the ground and developing these projects, our actual results to date on our exits have been much higher than that. They've been high-end private equity returns because it's just kind of built-in optionality to the way we go about doing it. So the way that we look at it, and we're in Africa, we're in Latin America, we're in Asia, and then we're in Europe, not for renewables because they're subsidized, but because a lot of the conventional generation there is underwater. So going back 6, 7 years, I took over our power investing, and we thematically decided, as power geeks, I mean, not investment banking background, M&A oriented, but really people who've made their careers in power, where's the best place to bring our skills to look for value dislocations? And what are the sort of rule books that we want as we go there to discern? So let's always begin with the end in mind. What do we want to do? And so we thought what we want to do is go to countries where actually for power, and this is solar, wind, hydro, gas-fired in terms of what we're doing, we want to be undercutting the cost of power. And so I think you look at some of the pressure, and less with these guys who have been established and doing a lot of directs in this field, but a lot of pressure that people are getting into infrastructure. There's like $2.6 trillion of money looking for about 156 billion. This is according to the FT of deals every year. So they're looking to try to get there. So they're taking volume risk. They're taking regulatory risk. They're taking price pressure risk, and the demographics are against you. Well, why don't we take what we're doing to the markets that actually you can undercut their cost of power, and they need it if they're underserved and overpriced. And so you've got the fundamentals there. And by the way, when you look around the world at long-term contracted things, where your fundamentals are there, and then you have contractual support, your default rates are very low. So for example, in Africa, the default rates on project finance deals are 3.1%. 3.1%. US power deals, this is over the last 30 years, 9.3%. Because your fundamentals are so entirely different.
Why are they so different?
They're different because, one, we work with IFC, we work with US OPEC, so you're bringing in multilaterals into these deals, and these local governments don't want to default against World Bank. There was a project that we didn't do, someone else did in Cote d'Ivoire, gas-fired generation station, that during the entire civil war in Cote d'Ivoire, the government never missed a payment. It's very, very typical because they need it. That's the other thing. And so if people in power absolutely need to keep the lights on, and generally their lights are not on, so they're trying their very best, and you're providing the lowest cost. So all those things help you do that. So you get that fundamental support. You get 20 years of contractual protection. Unlike many things that you can do in emerging markets, if you pick where you go appropriately, you can do one of two things. One, you can transact in direct linkage to hard currency. So we're in Ghana, where we are developing large power stations along with GE as a junior partner, where they're 30%, we're 70%. We're going to get paid in US dollar equivalents. We're in Cote d'Ivoire, we're going to get paid in euro equivalents, and they have to make that up. So we've got total take or pay, no volume risk, no regulatory risk on that side. You have multilaterals on these deals. So the default ratio is very, very low. So what our approach was to not just go anywhere. We didn't decide we want to be an emerging market play and then let's go figure out power. What we said is, let's get a playbook of things that we want to do. Let's go do that in those places. And let's do everything with an end in mind that you're going to have something exit. And that's why we're more private equity returns than you guys, because we're thinking in general we'll underwrite to a case that will hold something for a year or two after operations. We're going to step into development, commercial development. We'll take that over. We'll have world-class PPAs, EPCs. We'll be bringing in the multilaterals in our deal. We'll do all that, put the financing together, take it out, and then we'll let lower-cost money come in afterwards. So we begin with the exit in mind. So in our regions, we'll only go to certain countries, and we don't go to other regions. We're not in India because it doesn't meet our playbook for a whole variety of reasons. We're not in Eastern Europe for the same reason. And then within our regions, we're not in Venezuela. We're not going to be a first mover in Argentina. So we think it's a value dislocation, frankly.
Just as a side question, why is the default rate in that sector so high in the United States?
Well, I would say the top couple reasons are there's so much money that's geographically and domain constricted in the U.S. So people have to put money in. I sat at panels a few.
Give us an example to help understand that.
Well, you got lenders who, I sat on a panel in New Orleans, a Platts conference years ago, where you had a list of lenders up here basically saying, we're open for business, merchant financing, no PPAs, whatever. Our pocketbook, our pocketbooks are open. And so they're trying to put the money out the door. You have people who get up in the morning and don't know what to do with themselves, so they develop a power plant. You don't need it. You haven't needed it since 2001 or 2002. And all you've had, no power plant in the United States has been worth, other than contracted power plants, which are very rare, no power plant in the United States has been worth its replacement cost, period, ever. Right? It just doesn't happen. You trade like as low as 25 cents on a dollar, as high as 90 cents on a dollar, but none of them are worth 100 cents on the dollar. So people play this as a beta-driven game, and they're trying to put money out, and so you get a high default ratio. You don't have the fundamentals supporting you as you do in some of these other economies.
So I'll open this up. Who wants to describe the sort of pros and cons of working with emerging markets and developed markets?
I can talk about the developed markets because we don't do a lot in emerging markets.
Okay.
From the developed market standpoint, you can write larger checks because there are larger projects. There's a bigger base of brownfield opportunities to look at, brownfield being existing infrastructure rather than infrastructure that needs to be developed. In developing markets, you're investing in harder currencies in a place where the rule of law is well understood and enforceable. And so rather than going after the types of returns that you go after, we go after much lower returns, but we do so in a way where we can feel very confident about the capital preservation aspects of that capital. And our program is a buy and hold program for the most part. So we want to accumulate assets, hold them for a longer period of time because they provide important attributes to our fund, like inflation protection, which I spoke about, like current income, like diversification. And so I think what you're doing in Africa and elsewhere it makes a lot of sense. It's very compelling. It's different from the type of objectives that we have set for our program, and that's why the vast majority of our program is focused on OECD nations.
I have to agree with Andrew in that there's just two types of different, probably making it too simple, but there's core infrastructure, which lower risk, cash flowing, what Andrew's describing, inflation protection, and then there's higher risk, higher return infrastructure. I can only speak for our plan, but we have a lot more appetite for the lower risk, cash flowing inflation protection type of infrastructure, and it would sit in our portfolio, which is called inflation sensitive portfolio. And there is room for the higher risk, higher returning infrastructure as well, but that would be in a different risk bucket, competing with different strategies that have the different.
So I think it's interesting when you look at who the buyers. So let's say we develop a gas station in Ghana, so a gas-fired station in Ghana. Who's going to be the buyer? And that's what we think about. Who's the buyer? South African pension plans. They are the lowest cost of capital. One of the other PE houses marketed a minority interest in a dam in Uganda a couple of years ago. And I had one of the leading South African pension plans tell me that their cost of capital for that deal on a levered basis was 11%. They don't have the sort of views that the United States has about that. Then you've got strategics, and you've got the Middle East. There's a company called Aqua, who if you looked them up in the phone book in 2005, there was nobody home. Today they have 19,000 megawatts, and they're fueled by Saudi money. A lot of it's single digit. They come in and they buy these same projects. Why do they buy them? Because they're long-term, they're cash flow protected, they've got cash flow, their inflation. So. And my point is that when you've got $2.6 trillion of dollars looking to be placed in infrastructure with 156 billion of deals available. It's a matter of time until people start getting out into these markets. U.S. is a little bit behind. We're seeing the Europeans have already gotten in. Obviously, the Asians have gotten in. The Middle Eastern have gotten in. And the U.S. is going to have to get there as well, because it's ultimately to answer your point, you clearly don't have the size that you have, but you don't have the risk of people who are what we see in some of these situations. And again, not you fellows at all, but we see some of those situations. They're bidding to what we think are P10 assumptions on traffic in airports, or
Can you explain P10?
P10. So 90% of the cases are going to be worse. Only 10% of the cases are going to be better.
Okay.
But can we just talk a little bit about returns? So you both spoke about stable but lower returns. I think you mentioned 8 to 12%. I don't know what you target, Andrew, at your
Yeah, it's in that zip code, depending on the nature of the assets. Things that are demand-driven, like an airport,
Right.
you'll be in the 12% range. Things that are, say, a regulated asset or long-term contracted, something that it has a lot more stability associated with it, would be at those lower return levels. Scott, I think the strategy you're employing, it makes perfect sense. I'm not being critical of your strategy whatsoever. I'm just saying it's different from what we'd want.
Right.
No, absolutely. Don't take it that way.
Sorry, if I could just finish. So on the topic of returns, though, the IFC has historically invested only in emerging markets because that's our mandate. And infrastructure, our return has been typically 18 to 25% on for equity, which is reasonable. Going forward, we think it'll probably be more like 15 to 18%. But you said where you were investing, you were still making PE-type returns. So what is that, 30%?
Well, I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you.
Okay, you're one of those managers.
You seem quite nice. So.
You know what's interesting, though, is that when we've looked at it, we think there's a lot of uncompensated risks in emerging markets, maybe not on the development side that you're talking about, Scott, where you're bringing the project to fruition and then selling it, but on the examples that you said with people coming in and buying it at an 11% rate of return or something along that line, because we often look at alternatives. If we really wanted to get exposure to Ghana, for example, we could probably buy a sovereign product from Ghana. They probably issue in their local currency. They may even issue in dollars. I don't know. But often when we look at a number of emerging markets and we look at it versus publicly traded products, like a sovereign bond, we actually don't think that we're being properly compensated for the equity risk premium and the illiquidity risk that we're taking. And I mean, Brazil's a perfect example. We've looked at Brazil every which way to try to find a way to crack that nut. And what's hard is we see infrastructure projects there that you could earn 17% on, let's say, in real, but I can buy a 10-year sovereign bond from the Brazilian government for 15%. So why wouldn't I just buy bonds if I believed in a Brazilian turnaround? And I'd be, interested in some of the markets either that the IFC is doing business in or that Denham's doing business in. Like, how do you think about what fair return is? And are you looking at infrastructure products versus other products available in those markets?
So I think when you have an asset, as opposed to a government bond, you have all kinds of optionality and things that you're going to do, and your exits are going to be much better. So we begin by thinking about the exits. It's one of the reasons why we're not in India, where I think there's all kinds of uncompensated risk. But in Brazil, we go into Brazil and we put a management team on the ground that takes the best performing sites. And this isn't just me saying this, is Bloomberg New Energy Finance saying. So our guys get the best wind sites, the highest capacity factors, and because of asymmetrical knowledge, they get the highest PPA prices awarded. So they're doing about 300 basis points better than most other people in the market.
Greg, jump in.
Let me jump in a bit, because as you look at the profile, when we look at infrastructure, we tend to break down risk categories or buckets. And so we'll talk about operating and development risk. That's probably similar or the same depending on jurisdiction. We talk about financing and contractual risk. And Andrew talked about rule of law and how do we enforce those contractual rights, et cetera. The biggest risk or the biggest opportunity that we always see in infrastructure assets is regulatory and political. We have to manage the regulatory and political risk. So we like the rule of law in North America. That's why we do it. And we have to look now at regulatory and political risk. What's interesting is we tend to underestimate regulatory and political risk in the place that we actually live. So, one of the investments that I had the privilege of doing years ago was the 407 ETR, one of the larger toll road projects in Canada.
Say that again.
One of the largest.
Slower.
Sorry, one of the largest.
No, what is the project?
407. It's called the 407 ETR.
Okay.
It's a highway in northern Toronto, and we spent 3 years in a lawsuit with the government of Ontario, when one party was elected and elected on a campaign to cancel the contract and cancel the tolls, right in Canada. Then I look at Spain, and they were, rolling back tariffs on renewable power, and what that impact is. We look at UK water and the impact on the ROE and equity thickness and the discussions around regulatory returns with respect to UK water. So all of a sudden now you've got this overlay of regulatory and political risk. We just tend to say it's low risk in developed markets and high risk in emerging markets, but there's a spectrum. And there's a spectrum by state, there's a spectrum by province in Canada, a spectrum by country in Europe, et cetera, that we have to sort of overlay.
Is the problem sort of pricing the risk because you underestimate the risk where it might actually be higher?
Well, there's a sea change. When we first did our first transmission project in 2002, the old adage was if you wanted to build a transmission line, you went through farmers' lands, or in Canada, you had First Nations issues, but you could expropriate the land and just build where you wanted to build it. Now you've got consultation in place. When I first got involved, I still remember, I won't name the person, but they said, we love infrastructure assets because they're big physical assets and we don't have to deal with people. That has got to be the worst statement I've ever heard around infrastructure.
Well, I guess they meant regulators aren't necessarily people.
Yeah. The great thing about infrastructure assets is they touch a lot of people. And so we've learned that instead of dealing with the regulatory political risk head on, you've got a social and moral overlay. So you need a return to investors, but you actually need a return to the citizens, the ratepayers, the taxpayers. So we learned that corporate citizenship leads to, good community support leads to public support. Public support leads to government support. Government support then leads to good regulation and policy. You can't just argue policy and regulation. You've got to bring the population along with you. You've got to bring the communities along with you. People have an irrational love affair for their poles and wires and their roads and their bridges. And it's around understanding that how do you interact both with the municipalities, the states, different countries, and in the private sector. There's a big learning curve that is continuing to be adapted.
Scott, let me just ask you to clarify something. I think you said, you mentioned a couple times, $156 billion in deals available, but we're talking about a need for trillions of dollars of investment. What's the difference?
Getting deals done. I mean, that's one of the reasons why, we're doing what we're doing is, and you see this all the time. So, you have such a tremendous need for infrastructure, but getting the deals done. And that's true in the United States. I mean, boy, if you could redo a lot of our highways and bridges and actually get that done, that'd be awesome. But getting those deals done is tough. Same thing if you're overseas. It's stitching together all the things you need to do and getting a doable deal. There's so much money. I know this may sound strange, but there's so much money looking in Africa and Brazil. We're now in Vietnam, and I've been in the Philippines. So much money to getting into operational projects there that people are like the United States. They're having to move up the chain and take construction risk, and then they're willing to even take a little bit of development risk to try to get that, but they don't have a well-capitalized, knowledgeable entity to put it all together, and that's the gap.
And here's the challenge. So we sort of talked about it, generally, which is there's lots of capital. There's lots of equity capital. There's lots of debt capital, as you mentioned with the panels, looking for infrastructure investments, whether it's in domestic, developed markets or emerging markets. Then there's lots of need, right? We just talked about $90 trillion of need for infrastructure. Okay, so where's the problem? Why isn't the demand for infrastructure investment meeting the need for infrastructure dollars? And so where we look at it is there's a procurement problem, right? We need predictable, transparent pipeline, bankable, contract, the structures that actually work and evolve that allow the transactions to get done. So when we look at the different municipalities and we look at different states or different countries, we don't see that pipeline of projects in a fashion that it can actually be investable. So there's a need for it.
One of the first questions I asked was, who are the matchmakers? And this seems to suggest there's still a need for better matchmaking. Doesn't capitalism usually fill gaps like this? Why is it not happening?
It's much more than matchmaking. I mean, it is boring, tedious, watching paint dry.
Yeah.
Moving in and out of. I mean, and I cut my teeth in the United States. And by the way, the only times I had deals reneged on me, and the only times I ever had to testify against officials, were in Florida and in New Jersey.
State level?
County level.
Okay, not,
No, I think
not,
that's
in,
right.
not in Nigeria or Ireland.
2 people went to jail in both those cases.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's not that we'd have people, buyers and sellers, that aren't being connected and a match needs to be
Yep.
made. We've got people that are talking across purposes, or governments that have a desire to have a project supported, but have not put in the right basic ingredients to make it attractive to debt or equity providers.
So it's like the sellers don't know how to sell what they need to sell?
And it's not sellers. I think once you've got an existing piece of infrastructure, if a government decides that it wants to sell it, either through a full privatization or bringing on a capital partner, that's generally not a problem. I think it comes down to when you want something built or refurbished, and how do you actually make it attractive enough to fulfill the government's policy mission, as well as being attractive enough to attract capital. And one thing that I've been encouraging governments to do is make us part of that conversation early on, rather than sitting in a room and coming up with a design and then bringing it out and saying this is how we'd like to do it. Like, talk to the capital providers, involve them in early consultations, so that when you do come with a project, you've already pre-wired those capital providers. They're already aware of it and provided their input, and you know that it's going to be financeable. Because right now it's almost like there's 2 separate conversations happening. The people that would like to see the infrastructure built, and the people that hold the key to the money. And we need the Rosetta Stone in a way to translate that into a text that we can both use, because right now one's speaking Dutch and one's speaking Chinese.
Early identification is important. I think the other part that we see quite often is people confuse procurement methodology with the social issues or policy issues that they want to deal with. If I'm going to transfer our work with the private sector, do we have a union or non-union environment? What do we do with the union? Is there going to be user pay, or is there going to be availability payment? Do we want a user pay system, or how do we do that? And they confuse that with procurement methodology. So there's a lot of questions along the way that are really, where do you want your LRT to stop? We get that question all the time. We'll build it, just tell us where you want it to stop. So you have community issues, you've got union issues, you've got user pay issues, but you can still procure it. It just, you have to have those discussions around those social issues first in order to know what to procure. And that's, I think, where it starts to bog down a little bit.
Look, I think, I just want to make one more point. I think the reason that there's not more infrastructure investment in the United States is twofold. Firstly, there's a lot of existing infrastructure in the U.S. that needs to be repaired or replaced. And repairing or replacing infrastructure does not provide a ribbon-cutting opportunity for anyone. It's not high on a lot of people's agendas, right? So they kind of leave the bridges in Pennsylvania to continue to deteriorate, and eventually, when enough of them fall down, I guess they'll deal with the issue politically. I think you've also got a view that infrastructure, and this is bizarre that this is in some Western markets that have embraced capitalism, but a view that infrastructure is rightfully owned by government, that it should be controlled by government, that somehow involving private capital is the wrong thing to do. And I think that couldn't be further than the truth. If you look at some countries like United Kingdom, like Australia, like Chile, where we've had a lot of experience, by partnering with private capital providers, you're able to increase the effectiveness and the efficiency of your infrastructure. You're able to get more built, have it better maintained, have it more appropriately marketed to the extent it's demand-driven to customers. But we need to break down some of these walls around the thinking that critical infrastructure should be owned, built, owned, managed by government. And if we're able to do that, more will get built.
But an obstacle to that in emerging markets is that when you do it in the public sector, it supposedly costs you less, because you get subsidized loans from the World Bank and from the export credit agencies, and you don't have to pay a tariff to the private provider. So that bias is very difficult to break down. The only reason that emerging markets are moving more towards a PPP model or an IPP model is because the multilaterals no longer have the money to advance to them on the scale that's needed. And some of you may know that a few months ago, world governments met and agreed these new sustainable development goals, 17 of them, which require, trillions of dollars of expenditure. And there's only like 135 billion available from governments every year. And they figured out that in order to get these goals met, which include lots of infrastructure for developing markets, you need to mobilize about 900 billion a year from the private sector. So that 135 needs to partner with 900 billion. So we need to make these projects bankable and attractive.
So we're talking about infrastructure in the abstract. Can somebody who wants to tell me about a project that went south and a project that went surprisingly well?
I mean, I'm happy to talk about something that went well. We actually are big investors in Chile in water. We own 3 different monopolistic municipal waterworks in 3 of the regions in Chile. And at the time that we came into those assets, it's before Chile was considered an OECD country. And one of the reasons that it wasn't considered OECD is because there's a minimum level of clean water that needs to be available to your citizens to even qualify. And at the time, they weren't qualifying. These were government-owned entities that were dumping raw sewage into the rivers.
And this is around when?
10 years ago.
Okay.
Less than 15 years ago. Dumping a lot of untreated raw sewage into the rivers, providing drinking water, which in many cases were making people sick. And they were underfunded, and they didn't have a laser focus in terms of the management that was there and the metrics that they were using. And it was, frankly, a poorly run business that was underfunded. By us coming in and buying these, we were able to inject capital and management talent and the right oversight in order to treat now 100% of the sewage that's put in the rivers or into the ocean, and in order to dramatically increase the safety of the drinking water. And that doesn't just mean that people don't get the stomach flu. You know, this actually reduces infant deaths. It improves people's lifestyle. And so I think you can use real cases in point where you're able to bring private capital and a private ownership model, you know, that has oversight and has the election of properly experienced and compensated management team to make a real difference in people's lives.
And you bought that outright or with partners?
We own them outright.
So was there ever any political controversy about a Canadian pension fund owning the waterworks in Chile?
Yeah. Water is a very politicized area of infrastructure in developing countries and in developed countries. A lot of people think that water should be provided free of charge as a human right. I think if it was provided free of charge, the quality of the water would be very poor. So the people that make that argument may not be playing this forward and thinking about the implications. So we're quite proud about what we've been able to bring to that market and the service improvements we've been able to make. But I won't lie, it's not without some political backlash.
Did you anticipate the controversy? What was the controversy, and then how did you deal with it?
We probably did not anticipate it as well as we could have. We came into these businesses about 10 years ago. Do I understand it? Yes. Water is critical for agriculture. It's critical for life. However, I do think that we've got a very strong argument that in order to provide a quality service, it takes cost.
Yeah. Are they just arguing that these foreigners are making a profit off of our water, basically?
Chile's actually a pretty open country that way. I like to refer to it as the Switzerland of South America. It's pretty open. So we don't get too much attacks because we're foreign capital. I think the political aspect of those assets really have to do with the fact that we're providing local residents water, and water worldwide is quite a politicized area of infrastructure.
And then did you demonstrate, look, the quality of this product has gone way up since we professionalized it and so on?
Yes. But some people that will argue against you, it's not about the facts. They have a philosophical opinion on this, and you can give them all the facts in the world. Right, that's not going to change their mind because it's not a fact-based argument.
Right. Who else wants to describe a project?
Let me, on a lighter note, describe my favorite environmental and social story. So one of the big issues in developing infrastructure projects is protection of marine life, plant life, rights for native peoples, and so on. So many years ago, we did a project in Pakistan, which was to be built on a dry riverbed where there was a rare species of oyster, and this was a big issue for the World Bank because we didn't want to, harm this species. We solved it by getting the Japanese contractor to come and visit the construction site. They scooped up the oysters, ate them, and that was the end of the problem. It's no longer that easy, but that was one thing that we moved very quickly in that project.
That's funny. Well, I can give you one that worked and didn't. So in terms of the one that worked, I'll pick it because it raises a different issue here. We did some of the first wind and solar projects in South Africa. It's one of the few places that we'll go, Brazil being the other, where you don't have a direct linkage to a hard currency. So the rand is volatile, and it'll take all the juice out of your deal if you try to hedge it. And then if you hedge it, you're picking when you're going to exit, and we don't want to do that. So the reason why we went in there, for the same reason as Brazil, we have heavy statistical analysis that shows correlation of your rand falling to what happens with local inflation. And while your costs certainly are not escalating on wind and solar at local inflation, your revenues, when they do 100%, that makes it up. So we, between the time that we broke ground on those projects and we signed a contract to exit them, the rand went down 34% against the US dollar. But if you look at the delta between what happened in South African inflation and US inflation, that made up 75% of that. And we signed that contract, and we to exit those, we exited those at 3.3 times in US dollars. So again, if you have a playbook, that's where we would go, but we're not going to do it in some country where you have a currency there that you don't have that sort of backdrop. We thankfully haven't had a deal that we took to financial close, and so now you're committing all your equity, all the debt's there, contracts are all in place, and everything else. We haven't any of those moved sideways on us.
Yeah.
We're staging our capital during development, and that's where things have, we were in Sierra Leone looking at a hydro project, and obviously we wouldn't have done that without World Bank. IFC was actually trying very hard to get in the deal alongside us. And what we said is, look, we're going to spend a certain amount of money to get to a power purchase agreement. The first thing we looked at was that, and this is typical in emerging markets, the permitting wasn't done to World Bank standards. That was going to cost a few million more. The government said, well, why don't you go do that and then come back? I said, oh, okay, so we're not in the business of giving people free options. Why don't you sign a power purchase agreement with us first, and then we'll do that? And they said no, and they didn't have a motivation to do something. The president was going to be leaving. We weren't going to motivate him other than be commercial. He wasn't commercial. We'd spent a little bit of money, but we've been very diligent in how we staged our capital. So we said, okay, well, this is now officially a tent. We're picking it up and moving away. We sold the project back to the junior developer who is from the States and England, and off we went. So that was probably the worst one of those examples, but you have some of those where you spend some time doing it and then it's not going to work and you walk away.
Can someone describe exit strategy to me? Do you always want to exit in some fashion, or do you buy and hold? I guess it depends on the different type of project, but if someone could just run through that.
I think it probably more depends on the different type of investor as well as the different type of project. We have permanent capital, so we don't ever have to exit. I like to say we have the option, but not the obligation to sell. But we do sell from time to time. If value is above where we think fair value is, if for some reason the project has changed in nature where we're not satisfied that the attributes that it provides our infrastructure any longer, and you often get that in power markets where you've got long-term contracted power assets, but as those contracts come up to expiration and you're going to become a market, something that's selling directly into the market on a merchant basis, we'll sell. So, those are the kind of situations where, despite our permanency of capital, we'll look to exit.
And we play the sort of the opposite way. So we have a 12-year fund life when we look at an asset. So every time we underwrite an asset, we underwrite it like we're holding it for 40 or 50 or 60 years. But there's usually a period of 5 to 10 years where you can optimize the performance of an asset. So as an active manager, we talk about core infrastructure and then core value added. So we look to be able to either, how we acquire it, how we actually set up the structure, and how we work with opportunities, is being able to put those together and work an asset, to drive economies of scale, operating development improvements, et cetera, where then you put a basket of assets together and then you go to the market for somebody that's more of a passive investor. So we're very hands-on active.
Can you illustrate that with a specific project?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest trends that we're seeing in North America right now is in the area of retrofit and refurbishment of energy systems. So if you look at, everybody gets excited about building a new school or a new hospital, but there's so much existing infrastructure. And we have to go back and look at how do we actually refurbish and retrofit existing infrastructures. And so we have projects right now where we're working with higher education, university campuses, as well as healthcare campuses. So if you look at the demand side of energy as well as the supply side, so if you change out light bulbs to LED light bulbs and you change the windows, you work on the demand side of energy, but you also work on more efficient chillers and boilers and how the whole system works, you tend to improve the energy efficiency of a building from 25 to 40%. You take that money, securitize it, give the university or school an upfront check, and all of a sudden now you've got a very viable opportunity. So they're funding constrained. They now have a check they can use for core purposes like scholarships or research or building a new facility if they'd like to. So we create these kind of opportunities working with universities and healthcares and package them together and move forward. So again, part of the trouble with deal flow is eventually, if there's a couple panels that were earlier today, you have to pay for that infrastructure eventually. Somebody has to pay for it, the user or somebody else. So if we think around some of the developments that we've seen in technology improvements and energy efficiency improvements and use that to securitize those savings, all of a sudden it's now a positive revenue generator for those institutions.
Just one sec. We will take some questions if you all have questions in a couple of minutes. So if you have a question, raise your hand and get the microphone, and we'll just get that teed up. Go ahead, Kathy.
Oh, I was just going to say, exit is actually a big issue for a public plan like us who wants to hold passive investments in infrastructure for a long period of time. Some of the Canadian pensions where Andrew sits or works for has ability to invest direct, but many end investors are like North Carolina, where they currently do not have ability to invest direct. And the options for infrastructure investment for us is really through managers. And the managers often have the private equity model of 10 to 12-year life with management fee and carry structure. And that structure is not really ideal for limited partners where you're looking for lower return, lower risk strategy, because it's high fee, and when you take out like 3% net gross return difference from 10%, it becomes not that attractive. So I think that's another barrier that is between end investors and infrastructure investing.
This is exactly, if I interject, this is exactly why we got into the direct business, is because we wanted to build a meaningful portfolio. Today it's about 17 billion Canadian dollars, or about 10% of our assets. So not one that was turning over, and one that we could have control over in terms of the attributes of the types of investments we put into that portfolio, such that it helps satisfy our overall portfolio construction desires and mixes. And so, frankly, we could do it more cost effectively, because we've got two great managers here, and I'm not trying to be critical of them in any way, but in some manager areas, you worry about either asset accumulation, because people say, look, I'm not going to go for performance fees. I'm going to go for accumulation and make a lot of money off of managing billions and billions of assets. Or you often can get managers that buy assets that are more resemble private equity than infrastructure, in order to get the returns that justify the costs, and including the carry, right? So early on, we said, look, rather than get into that game, we'd prefer to just bring it in-house, and we have 45 people that are managing a large portfolio in-house. And so, that's what we've done. The conundrum that some of the U.S. plans have, though, is they're either not large enough, or they don't have a model in terms of employment that they can justify well enough to build a large enough direct team to go direct. Yeah. And so, Kathy's left with the conundrum of, committing to managers or being undercommitted.
Yeah, I'm curious about toll roads. This is something that has come up in a couple of communities in the United States. I think there's one new one in Indiana. There's another one in Chicago. I think this is happening in some other countries. And it's, in theory, well, states don't have the money to refurbish, certain roads, so they bring in a private partner, and then that private partner takes the cash flow off the tolls. But does that work, or is that more trouble than it's worth?
I think it works great.
I think it works.
It does.
Yeah, for a number of reasons. One of the flaws with the old infrastructure model, which is government builds it, owns it, and provides it free of charge, is they've given up the ability to use pricing as a tool to motivate certain behaviors. Right?
Because you mean among the users?
Among the users.
Because
free
there is no
goods,
price.
Economics 101 will teach you free goods are always overconsumed, right? And so if we want to encourage people to drive their cars too much, and create congestion and pollute our environment, make all the roads free, which is what most governments have done. Yeah. If you actually say, look, we're not going to make roads free, we're going to charge people for using roads, and we may even have dynamic pricing, which means if you want to use the road at a peak hour, it's going to cost you more than if you want to use it in non-peak hours. You can solve a lot of issues. Firstly, you help solve a funding gap, because you take an asset that used to be a cost center and you make it into a revenue center. Secondly, you encourage good behavior through pricing. And thirdly, by bringing in people like ourselves or Greg or anyone else, Scott, anyone else, you're able to bring in people that have expertise on maintaining these roads. Governments, I would argue, are not the best at building or maintaining assets. They're great at making policy decisions and deciding what should get built and how they can best serve their constituents. But by bringing in private capital providers like ourselves, we believe we can do it more effectively and efficiently.
So there will be more toll roads in North America and Europe?
There has to be. Now, again, if I take another step back, there still has to be this balance between the social moral overlay
Right.
and the economic model that Andrew's talking about. So when you set up a toll road, there always has to be a free alternative. There has to be a way to get there without paying. There has to be higher investment in public transit or mass transit to sort of help counteract sort of the toll, because you need to have alternatives. So toll roads have their place and purpose. They're not a panacea where you're going to see every road tolled, but it is around, as Andrew sort of talked about, sort of readjusting and being able to measure it. I mean, I'd like everything to be free, but it's not. So we have to sort of figure out what that system is.
Who has the microphone? Go ahead, and just keep the question short, please. Go ahead.
Sure. So I have a question for the IFC person. Just for context, I work for an emerging market mutual fund investing in equities of infrastructure operators, among other things. One of the frustrations that I've historically had is the concession terms are quite different across the world. And specifically in Asia, the concession terms seem to be very unfavorable. I'm talking about toll roads, airports, such as lack of inflation pass-through, constant changes in concessions, a lot of state involvement on the equity side in the projects. When you're dealing with various entities in Asia, Asia Pacific, are you trying to advise them to more unify the concession terms to bring them more in line with, market best practices?
Yes, so we actually have a whole separate group of people called the PPP advisory team, and they actually work with governments for many years to structure the concession documents and set up the bidding process. So we do strive to sort of have consistency globally, actually, and to use what we think are the best packages. Unfortunately, our clients are not uniform, so some people will accept what we tell them and some won't, which is why you see quite a variety. But yes, our goal is to make those projects bankable before they go to market.
Microphone is where? I see hands, but the hand has to match the microphone.
Thank you. A question is about domestic infrastructure investing. There's a lot of talk about America's crumbling infrastructure, but what is the economic play for a fund or manager? Where's the economic return if you're building bridges, or rebuilding bridges, or schools, or streets where there is no toll road? Toll roads in America are not really big. There's special little sections of existing highways, but I don't see, the whole discussion here is about international for the most part, the economic play. But in America, there's this big push in the dialogue. Every politician talks about it. So how do you see the economic impact for this group of people like yourself on the investment side and, of course, the managers?
I mean, broadly speaking, I think the examples that you used are examples of social infrastructure. So you're right, there's no model, like you don't charge for a school. And the way that governments typically go about that is by providing an availability payment. So they'll say if somebody builds it and maintains it to a certain minimum level, the government will, from their revenues, pay them an availability payment. That works quite well for schools and hospitals, for free roads. We as an investor actually prefer investments that are less availability payment driven and more that have a demand component to them, because we believe if it's got a demand component to them, we can manage those better, and in managing those better, we can earn outsized returns from it. But there is a big universe of investors in the infrastructure world who invest in these types of availability payment driven social infrastructure projects.
The availability payment's a neat way to go. Another example was Sea to Sky Highway.
Say it slower.
Sea to Sky Highway. Sorry. Sea to Sky Highway is a highway from Vancouver up to Whistler. And it was built on a shadow toll. So a portion of the road, it was an availability payment, but it was a shadow toll. And what the government went there and
What
did,
is a shadow toll?
A shadow toll is where they're paying you per vehicle, but it's not a user pay system. So it's not visible to the user, but the government is paying you on a per car basis, so a shadow toll basis. But what the government there did is say we had $600 million to build a highway. How much can you twin to make it safer, and how long can you build it for $600 million? So they went out and instead of tendering how much can you build this road for and give me the lowest cost, they said, I have $600 million. How safe and how much road can you build for that amount of money? And then they paid a shadow toll. So this is, again, some of the innovation that you can start to see around objectives. Instead of sort of flipping the dial a little bit, is talk about safety, talk about length, talk about different payment mechanisms that could work.
I'll ask a follow-up on that. There have been some remarks here that suggest that the United States is not a very good place to invest private money in infrastructure for a variety of problems we've discussed. political issues and other things like that. How would you rank the United States in terms of a place to invest?
I think it's very high on the list. You
do? Okay.
The issue that we've got in the U.S. is there's a lot of people that are desirous to put money to work here because they're U.S. investors, and you'd rather have a U.S. dollar investment, U.S. inflation protection, et cetera. And there's just not a lot of product to invest in. But I think if the Americans were to make available
right? So when you
more-
hear politicians saying the United States is falling apart, it gets a D+ grade from the ASCE and so on.
There's just a difference between already privatized assets that's being transacted between private parties, which is very attractive for investors, and then there's PPP model, which involves political risk depending on the state, depending
And that's
on
public-private partnership.
Public-private partnership. So that's not as attractive to investors and investors like us because there's other risk. And then there's privatization, which is when government tries to sell something off, right? So it's probably this PPP side that needs.
Rest assured, if more assets were available that were investable assets in the United States, there'd be tremendous demand for them. Tremendous.
There is a great demand. I'll just say the one thing that can improve upon the U.S. is the final approval process. So most jurisdictions would be, we have approval to enter into a contract, now we're going to tender it. And you go through the process of being shortlisted. We spend millions of dollars building, designing, engineering, financing, coming up with a final product. In the U.S., there's always a final approval process.
7 years in the legislature is not fast enough?
Yeah, so once you get it through the system and we spend all this time bidding it, then somebody can veto it. And that's harsh in terms of the time and effort to be spent. You can actually get more competition and better value if you change that approval.
If I can just say, my comment about the U.S. is really not broadly about infrastructure, it's specific about power, because I think it's actually less like infrastructure in the United States than it is where we are.
Okay, go ahead.
Just a quick question, following up on that question of innovation in project development and infrastructure for Scott. Having worked both in the U.S. And emerging markets, how much of project development is the same across markets, standardized, if you will, and how much is really idiosyncratic to the region? For example, my interest in Africa. Are there such thing as an African project developer, and do they have different skills than other places? And do you see reverse innovation where you've learned things in emerging markets that you've brought back to your projects in developing markets?
A great question. Since I've been doing development, whenever you show up in a town, whether it's Fort Myers, Florida, Hudson County, New Jersey, or Accra, Ghana, there's some guy or some woman who's going to take you around the shoulder and say, listen, you got to do things the local way here. We're different than everybody else. So that is a commonality that everybody thinks they're different. But I think what we try to bring is emerging of international standards, because again, we've got a rule book, right? We don't want, if we go into Brazil, we don't want to just sell to Brazilians. Nothing against Brazilians, but there may be something that happens there that will take buyers out of the market. We want buyers from Europe, we want buyers from China, we want buyers from pretty much everywhere. And so we want to bring things to international standards. Now, they're not going to be entirely that way, and if we did it just as a bunch of, kind of gringos going down there, we'd get our butt kicked. So we need to have a team that gives us local edge to find ways to add basis points around return and things like that. So it's a mixture, but our Bible is that at the end of the day, it has to be international standards. It has to be something that we think is going to pass muster with multilaterals or international banks, and then ultimately we can feel comfortable putting our money into on a risk-reward basis, and that's what we solve for, and we walk away otherwise. I was at a panel here yesterday in Africa where somebody said, well, we should just, why don't, someone said, well, just throw away your checklist and just do deals. Well, that won't end well. You've got to think about the local side, but you clearly have to bring things to international standards. And I think the sooner you can get that way, the better. I negotiated a deal a long time ago in Hudson County, New Jersey, where you could never get them to international standards. So ultimately, we had to walk away from it.
Let me go for one more question over here. I think this will be the last one.
My question is to Andrew. Many congratulations on winning London City Airport with your consortium.
Yeah, thank you.
Could you just talk us through how you built the consortium and paid the multiple that you did it? The market says it's overpriced and significant. Could you just determine where you saw the value and how you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the consortium came together. There were two separate consortiums, and as the auction went on, we found a way to come together into what was known in the British press as the Grand, I think, consortium. In terms of the multiple that was rumored to be paid, multiples in infrastructure really just indicate, the amount of growth that you're expecting to be able to achieve during the ownership period of the asset. So you pay a high multiple of current earnings because you expect earnings are going to grow significantly during your hold period. And we do expect that with London City. It is the 5th largest airport in London by passengers. The London market is quite heavily constrained with a lot of options being debated by the Airports Commission, as I'm sure you're aware, Michael, including a 3rd runway possibly at London Heathrow. That's going to take 10 to 15 years at a minimum. And given that London is the largest aviation market in the world today and will only grow in our expectation from here, that congestion in that market should translate to more traffic at London City. We also have a plan to transform the asset, to build a new terminal, to build more skirting, to increase capacity. And so we have a lot of plans over our ownership period where we hope to transform that asset from today, which is the 5th largest airport in London, to something much more meaningful. And the multiple of current earnings that we were able to justify paying reflects that.
That's it. We are out of time. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Great meeting you, Kathy.